in order to carry out the timing belt removal and refit procedure on the new EB engine, there are new tools available to help you do this. They are an engine timing kit. This consists of a flywheel locking peg and a camshaft locking bracket. There is also a toolkit available to help you refit the ancillaries drive belt and water pump belt. That toolkit consists of the tool for refitting the ancillaries belt and the water pump belt.
We're starting this process by identifying at the back of the engine there is an earth point that will need to be removed during the process. Our engine, as you can see, is on a stand, therefore some of the components have already been removed, such as the wheel arch cover and the air filter box. I am at the moment removing the coils, but you'll also note during this process that the auxiliary drive belt has already been removed for me. We're going to try not to bore you too much with this process, so we've speeded it up, and then we can get the manifold out of the way and hopefully start to remove the cover for the top of the engine. Once the 5 bolts are removed, the manifold will lift fairly easily out of the way. You can now see we're just pointing to the earth point again, and now we're going to take a 10mm spanner, 10mm socket, and remove the earth point, and you'll see it in all of its glory. And there it is. So now we just need to remove the ring of bolts that hold the cover in place. Again, this is not an exciting process, and I think most of you will already be aware of this process, so we're going to speed the process up again to save you the boredom. For those that are worried that your managers might be watching this, you can obviously confirm with them that you've seen me working in the normal environment, and I don't normally work at this speed. So once we've removed all of the bolts, we can then remove the cover from the top of the engine, exposing our camshafts. The first part of the process now is to obviously ensure that our camshafts are in the correct position for timing the engine up, and we do this by ensuring that the flats are all uppermost and the crescent shapes are towards the bottom. In the instructions it says to angle the camshafts at around about 30 degrees. This allows a small amount of movement for pegging the flywheel and thus aligning the camshafts. So we'll take the flywheel peg and we'll insert it in a moment, but before we do that we're going to remove the electrical connection from injector number 3. So now pegging the flywheel, we'll rotate the engine through a few degrees after inserting the flywheel locking pin in the bottom of the engine. Once the pin's located, the engine should be locked up, and also the camshafts should be aligned. Once the camshafts are aligned, this allows us to fit the locking bracket. The locking bracket is a 2-piece bracket which does have an adjusting bolt in the middle. The bolt should be loose during the initial fitting. Once fitted, it should be tightened and left that way until the camshafts have been completely rebuilt. When the bracket's in place, it can be held down flush against the mating surfaces of the seals using 2 bolts from the cover. This allows us then to start removing the rest of the components, such as the auxiliary drive belt and the timing cover. Once the timing cover is removed, we'll then start to remove the dynamic tensioner and the idle roller. You can now clearly see the timing belt. The next thing we'll remove is the crankshaft pinion locking bolt and the crankshaft pinion and the drive gear from the crankshaft. During removal of the crankshaft pinion and the timing gear drive mechanism, the seal may become damaged. As such, the recommendation is that the seal is removed at this stage and replaced. You can now see on the crankshaft pinion there is a peg, and also on the crankshaft itself there's a keyway that the peg will fit into. This makes refitting and rebuilding of the pinion a lot easier. The last components to remove are the two dephasers. The two dephasers are clearly marked, exhaust and inlet, and are also keyed onto the camshafts themselves. You'll notice as the dephasers are removed, you will actually see the keyways on the camshafts. And as you can now see, each of the dephasers is clearly marked. Next thing we need to do is identify direction of rotation of the belt. This is very important if the belt is to be reused. Then the belt can be removed from the engine and any work that needs to be carried out can be done. The next part of the process is refitting of the timing belt. Obviously we have to make sure that the direction of rotation is correct, and when the belt is in we also have to ensure that the information is at the top end of the engine. This means that we can clearly see the yellow marks which will line up with the two dephasers when they're fitted. Now that the belt is in place, we can refit the drive mechanism, the drive gear for the timing belt, and also the crankshaft pinion. To make the crankshaft pinion easier to fit, there are marks which line up with one of the bolt drillings, and you can see there's a minor drilling in the pinion which lines up with the bolt marking in a horizontal position. We then refit the bolt to finger tight, allowing the timing belt drive gear to still rotate. Once the pinion is fitted, that allows us then to fit the idler roller back into place. And then we can fit the dynamic tensioner. When fitting the dynamic tensioner, we must ensure that the Allen key bolt hole is uppermost. This ensures that when you come to tension the tensioner, it's easier to do. The dynamic tensioner and roller can be left finger tight at this stage. The last components to fit are the phasers. As you can see, clearly marked exhaust and inlet, and so are the camshafts, so you shouldn't have any problem identifying which is which. When fitting the dephasers, if you use the identification markings and put them at around about 5 o'clock, you should line up the keys on the camshaft and the dephaser without too much trouble. This applies also to the inlet camshaft. Again, line up the identification marking at roughly 5 o'clock and then the keyway should be in the right place. Once the dephasers are fitted, we then need to fit the timing belt. You can see the marks, the yellow marks on the timing belt, should now line up with the two marks on the outside of the dephasers, both the exhaust dephaser and the inlet dephaser. There are two marks between the two dephasers which will not line up at this stage. For tightening of the dephasers, again this is a two-step stage. The two-step stage requires first of all a torque setting and then an angle setting. Once the dephasers are tight in place and correctly tightened, we then need to adjust our dynamic tensioner. This is done by using an Allen key. The Allen key should be fitted correctly into the bolt hole, but not too far in. If you push the Allen key too far through the adjuster, what will happen is it will make contact with the base plate and then the two timing marks, the two aligning marks, won't line up. Once the lining marks are aligned, you can tighten off the bolt, and then using a torque wrench we can correctly tighten both the dynamic tensioner and the idle roller. Finally, we now need to tighten up the crankshaft pinion bolt. This is also a two-stage tightening. First of all with a torque wrench setting, and then secondly with an angle setting. This ensures that the pinion is tight enough to allow drive through the drive gear. Once this is done, we can remove first the crankshaft, the camshaft brackets, and then the flywheel pin. This will allow us to rotate the engine through 2 rotations and to check that the timing marks haven't moved during this process. First of all, we replace the flywheel pin. And then we replace the camshaft bracket. The camshaft bracket should fall back into place without any force. This ensures that the cams are still in the correct position.